Flack Talk with James Canning, the podcast with the inside scoop on journalists from San Diego and across the nation. If you're a communications pro, have a nose for news, or you're just nosy, this is the podcast for you. Now here's your host, James Canning.
Hey everyone, James Canning here. I launched Flack Talk at the start of 2023, and it's been a fun ride so far. I've received great feedback, including recently from a person I went to college with at Wayne State University, Tina Kozak. Tina is now the CEO of Franco, which is an integrated communications firm based in Detroit, Michigan. Tina asked me to be a guest on their podcast, Frankly. And of course I said yes. I spoke frankly with Dan and Rachel, who are the hosts of Frankly, about what it's like to work in government communications and why it's important to believe in the people you work for. Here I am on episode 17 of Frankly. Check it out. Hello, welcome back to Frankly.
Welcome.
Today we have a great interview with James Canning, who is another podcast host.
Hello, podcaster. We love it.
So he hosts the Flack Talk podcast, which is a show for PR pros, journalists, everybody else. It kind of highlights journalists' stories about themselves and their careers and things like that, which is a little bit different from having a bit here, but really a great show. You should check it out. We'll link it in the description. But James, in addition to that, is also a seasoned government affairs, public affairs, and communications leader. He's spent a lot of time working with the mayor of Detroit, which we'll get into a little bit. He also then went on to Seattle, now in San Diego.
Yeah, and also did a little bit of freelancing and agency work in his time in Detroit, too.
Exactly.
He talks about kind of having a job shake up in your late 20s and what that meant for him and the way that he took it. So if you're in that scenario right now or starting out, it's just good to hear somebody who basically said, like, I didn't have it figured out at that point either. So
somebody else has been there before.
Absolutely.
So great interview. Stay tuned for that. We're also going to hear from Ed here in a little bit on Tales from the Beat. He's going to be talking about some of the ways that writing headlines is very different for PR pros versus journalists, and especially for journalists, how things are changing for them, looking at headlines really based on how they're going to perform on in search, looking
Google
at the SEL
search.
value of headlines and how it changes based on your audience and your...
I feel like it also lends to like that term clickbait,
Yes.
right? Because while sometimes it can feel like clickbait, there's a science behind it based on search because people are actually searching for these things.
Yeah. So how to optimize without getting
Yes.
clickbaity.
Yep, exactly. So with that, enjoy.
All right. James, welcome to Frankly.
Hey, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so I think this is a little bit different from a lot of our guests, more on the kind of public affairs or government communication side of things. So we're really looking forward to having this chat with you. It'll be a good time.
Yeah, I'm glad to do it. I love talking about the craft. I love it.
Yeah, so James came to us. He knows Tina Kozak, who is our CEO, and she was like, you got to talk to James. So I think it'll be a good conversation because she's looking forward to it. Can you start by walking us through your career path, right? So we were talking off air and you were talking about how you've done government and public affairs, but you've also done agency work and everything. Kind of take the listeners through your path, how you got to where you are and where you're at now.
All right. Well, that's like 20 something years. I don't even know if you guys were born when I was doing this stuff, but we'll start there. So I'll start like where it really started for me. So it started in high school, which is kind of crazy. So like there was this position, you were going to be the public relations chair of the student council. And what that meant was that you had to talk on the PA system. And so I was excited to go on the PA system and just talk. And then as I, transitioned from high school to college, I was looking around, trying to figure out what to do. My parents were like, oh, you should be a teacher. You know, you can do, and it felt safe for them if I was a teacher.
Yeah.
And I was like, I learned that you could be a public relations person. And I was like, there's a degree for this. What is this? I get to just talk to people all the time. Cool. I like it.
Yeah. And in high school, you're right. That's not like, I had no idea what that was. No idea.
Yeah. No idea. But it was like, oh, just talking. That's great. All my teachers complained about how I talked all the time. So I was like, oh, this is gonna be awesome.
Yeah.
And then I get to college, and so I went to Wayne State. That's where I met Tina, is at Wayne State.
Yep.
And I was on the communications track, but it was really the journalism classes that I took that taught me what communications was going to be about. You know, I mean, like I had a great editing class. I had a great news writing class that was just amazing. And the teacher, like, she failed me, I think, the first time because I didn't know how to write an article. I wrote it in first person. And she was like, that's not how an article's written. I'm like, man, I got to start listening or reading the paper a little more.
Yeah.
Anyways, so I went to Wayne State. The year I was going to graduate, I got a call from one of my professors, and he was like, hey, I got this great opportunity. Are you interested in it? And I'm like, well, I haven't graduated yet. And he says, well, Mr. Canning, sometimes opportunity comes when you least expect it. You want a job? And I'm like, okay.
Were you close to graduating at least?
Yeah, it was my last semester.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
So it was last semester. And so the firm I went to work for was this firm that's kind of gone through some transitions, I know now, back there, but it was Berg Muirhead at the time.
Yep.
And both partners had worked in government and worked for Coleman Young, which is the first black mayor of Detroit, right? Everyone knows. And I didn't know who they were. They didn't have a website at the time, nothing. And so I go in, I talk to these folks, and I learn like they're kind of this political communications royalty in Detroit. And I was like, this is amazing. And I got the opportunity at that firm to work on a project for the mayor of Detroit, who at that time was a guy named Kwame Kilpatrick. And he was the youngest mayor at 31 years old. And so I worked on a project for his office. I got to know some people in his office. And then by the time I was 24, I went to work in his office. They asked me to come work there. And so I was a communications coordinator, which meant I had to get up at 5 a.m. and do clips and send everybody an email and call the TV stations and figure stuff out. And then I ascended to like the deputy press secretary role. And then I ended my tenure with him when he left office. So he resigned amid a
quite a crisis.
Yeah, quite a crisis.
We call it what it is. It was a crisis.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so I left there, and it was great. You know, I enjoyed that experience. And if you guys want to talk about that, I'm happy to do that. Yeah, sure. But when I went from there, I went on my own. I did some for about 5.5 years. Okay. I did my own communications firm, Canning Communications. You know, I was trying to do my own thing. And I had some great clients. Like I worked for the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, who was working with the Kresge Foundation at the time on this Detroit Future City project. I worked with the Downtown Partnership. They were sponsoring what was called Detroit Restaurant Week. And they had a client, or the promoter of that was a group called Paxahau, who also does the Movement Electronic Music Festival. Yeah. And so Paxahau was my client for the festival for 4 years or so. And then I did Restaurant Week. And then I had a bunch of like little in between stuff. You know, I would help other firms and things like that. I'd serve as, you know, kind of a add-on, you know, person for them.
Truly freelancing. I mean,
yeah.
Anywhere you were needed, you know, sounds like you were kind of there.
Yeah, I was ready to go. And then I kind of parlayed that into an opportunity to go work for a firm called a competitor of yours, I guess, a bit, Aluvio George. Oh, yeah. They took me on, and I brought some of my clients with me there, and I was their public affairs director there, and worked on the M1 rail project. That was kind of my big client for them. Yeah. And then I got tapped on the shoulder by executive Warren Evans. He called, or people in his office called, and they said, hey, Warren would really love to, you know, invite you to maybe be his comms director. And I said, okay. Yeah. And so I did that for a year. And then at home, we had an opportunity. My wife at the time had an opportunity to go to Seattle and she was in tech and she wanted to do all this stuff. And so I said, great, okay, I'll go. And so I went to Seattle, got a campaign job. I never really worked on a campaign directly, but I was a campaign staffer and worked on a $54 billion transit measure for the third installment of regional transit in Seattle. And I'll tell you, transit in Seattle is amazing, to the point where, we come from the Motor City. We had two cars. We got rid of one car. Like, we were able to kind of just use the transit system. So that campaign won. People were like, oh my God, this thing wasn't going to win. And it won. And then we left Seattle, and Seattle was nice, great town. Like, I worked at a public affairs firm there. It was cool. But we really wanted to be in the sun. And so then I moved to Seattle into San Diego in 2018. And I started doing the rounds, kind of getting to understand and know people. And I kept asking, who is the star, like, political person? Like, I was always been like really wanting to be involved in the community, the city that I lived in. Yeah. And they were like, there's this guy, his name's Nathan Fletcher. Like, he's a up and comer. And some people were like telling me about it. Everybody kept saying it. Everybody had asked different people. And so he had a job opening, he put it up on Twitter, and I applied and I got the job. And it was kind of weird. And people told me this, and I felt really fortunate because, like every town, there's a bit of an insider game, right? Yeah. And I had just gotten there. I'd been there 3 months. Right. And they hired me, and they were like, that's just so weird for San Diego, kind of landscape. And so I've been with him now since 2019 when he got sworn in. And, he's been the chair of the board for 2 years, great political leader. And so that's currently where I'm at right now.
Nice. Yeah, that is so, I guess, different or so unexpected to come in as a newcomer to the town. What was that like, trying to get to know the community, trying to get to know even like the reporters, just the way San Diego is if you're just coming in and then immediately into a public affairs kind of direct to the public role? Yeah.
So let me tell you, it was an experience I had in Detroit that really prepared me to come in here and do this, right? So I was at the time when I went to work for the mayor, I had a communications director that had been a news director at WXYZ Channel 7. Okay. And so he said, James, if you're going to be my comms coordinator, I need you to understand how a newsroom works. Yeah. And so he sent me to Channel 7, and I sat there for a day or two, or not a day or two, an hour or two, and with a guy named Mickey McCannum, news desk guy. And Mickey walked me through how the newsroom operates, meaning the morning meeting, the afternoon meeting. He told me, like, you got to get to know these groups of people in the newsroom. Like, everybody thinks you call the anchors, you don't call the anchor. Like, he just really let me know. Yeah. And that's how that experience, like, it changed how I dealt with media during when I worked for the mayor, but then just afterwards when I was on my own and working for other people. Yeah. And when I got out here, I'm like, well, I don't know any of the media. What's happening? And we were getting sworn in on that Monday. So that weekend I spent calling every news station, getting the news desk line number, and then asking, okay, I'm the new guy that works for Fletcher. Who do I call in the morning? Who do I call? And by the time I got in, like, in my own, I didn't even have my county phone, I think, at the time. So I was pumping in these numbers into my personal phone. And I'm like, and as soon as he got sworn in, like, I was making calls that morning going, hey, he'll talk to you, he'll do this. And I just kind of like my instinct kind of like click in. And it was like, oh, because like, if you know how to do these jobs, you can apply that skill anywhere. Right. And then it's incumbent upon you to get to learn the community, right? And once you know the community, you just do what you know how to do.
I think what's helpful in that scenario too is that you were in a position that people were going to need to know who you were. At the end of the day, as much as you needed them, they needed you too, because the public elected officials are always getting called on for things, right? So it was kind of smart of you to say, hey, I want to understand how I can help you because you're going to need to call me too, right? That's helpful a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, it's helpful. And I think for anyone, I've been talking to some of my younger team members. So I have a small team. I have a digital content manager, and then I have a person that does like multimedia designer. Okay. And then I have another person that does some amplification. And I was talking to them about, recently, like your job, when you have the opportunity to work in government, what people kind of don't realize from it, because you're like, oh, I just did this, or I did this. It's kind of you're a jack of all trades. Like you do everything.
Yeah.
And so, and the reality is that the experience that you have is really accelerated, you know, because you are kind of put in this position where you, like you said, Rachel, like you're kind of important to certain people.
You are.
So you kind of act like that, and like not in a rude way or anything like that, but like you've done things now. You know, I was like, when I worked for the mayor, I was 24 years old having conversations with 40-something-year-old men and women and telling them what they need to be doing.
Well, and that's
something that I never thought I'd be doing.
You can't have imposter syndrome when you're doing that either, right? Half the battle in a lot of these roles to be taken seriously is just approaching situations with confidence. And if you don't sound like you trust what you're saying, then why should anybody else?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just going to say that you learned that from a young age, and I feel like it led you well. You had no idea what you were going to be put through in those jobs, but thank God you got that experience when you did and learned that.
So, you know, sometimes as a young public relations person, like you work at a firm, right? And the firm I worked at, like I was kind of the media guy. I really liked media. I liked interacting with the reporters. And so like I would call reporters, I called newsrooms and be like, hi, I'm James Canning and I got this client, and I would talk real fast because sometimes they'd hang up the phone, right? Yeah. And when I got to the mayor's office, I remember I called Tom Walsh. I'd probably been there like 2 weeks, and I called Tom Walsh. He's, for the folks that don't know, right? He's a kind of a really revered columnist that was in Detroit. He's retired since Detroit Free Press. Free Press. And I called him and I was like, hey, Mr. Walsh, this is James Canning calling from the mayor's office. Had my conversation with him. I hung up the phone, and my boss looked at me and he said, the communications director, and he goes, you don't call him Mr. Walsh, you call him Tom. You are James, he is Tom. You're on the same level.
First name basis.
Yeah. Like you belong here, and like you talk to him like you are his equal.
Yep.
And it was such a refresh, like it gave me that confidence that you spoke about, Rachel, right? That like I belong here, and if I know what I'm doing, you know, then they're going to be okay with it. And frankly, when I didn't know, I would ask the people around me. And I think that's what a lot of young folks got to make sure they do.
Yeah, sure. So sticking in the city of Detroit role for a little bit here, like there was, I'm sure, some like very highs early on in that role with the mayor's office. I mean, that Kwame was, being talked about as potentially the future of the party kind of thing at that time.
Right.
So what was it like going from like the extreme highs to maybe some of the extreme lows later towards resignation and things like that? I mean, that's there's so much up and down in the public affairs space.
There is, and I think that credit to the leaders that were on our comms team early on, like they gave me the role and kind of broke me in a way that allowed me to learn the organization and learn the mayor. And the highs were really like my job when I got there was to dig out the good news that was happening in city government. Yeah. So like I worked with all the departments. So you think like all the press conferences and all the events you think about that are like, I don't know, we're kicking off snowplow season. Oh, we're doing the cleaning event. Oh, we're doing like, I was there, like that's what I was kind of project managing those comms efforts. And so by the time I got to like 2 years in, I really knew the organization really well. Yeah. And so and the high for me was like, oh, I'm like, this guy's doing great work. We're digging it out. And I'm telling people, I'm helping tell people about it. Yep. And, I would write the annual reports and it was like great. It was fun. And then as I got into it a little bit more, my role got to be, I was not just talking about what the mayor was doing, but then I was talking about, I was speaking on his behalf, Right. So when I ascended to that role, I was really excited, really honored to be doing that. And then when we got, there was always a kind of a level of controversy or crisis around him, right? And you kind of get into this mode where you deal with that, but you keep doing your job. And
you have to separate them, right? Like, did you feel like you had to separate like who he was and what he was doing from the job that you had to do too?
Yeah, I mean, like, this was a guy that I voted for. Never thought I'd have a chance to work for him. Like, it just didn't cross my mind, right? Yeah. So, like, I was a believer before I walked in the door.
Yeah.
And so, like, a lot of the things that people talk about now or, view him as now, like, okay, I see it. I hear what you're saying, but like, when you're in the place with the person and you see what kind of person they are, like, even at the point of like, and people sometimes forget this, like, there was the thing that took him out of office, right, was, he had an extramarital affair, and unfortunately he didn't tell the truth when he was on the stand about it. Like, that's what took him out. Now, all those other things that happened after he left office, like, I always tell people, like, I don't know if that happened. He says it didn't happen. Other people say it did. That wasn't a part of my job every day.
Right.
Yeah.
My job was like the city stuff. Now, when it got to that issue with the extramarital affair, that's when it became tough, right? Because people were like, "Oh, this is," and at that time, I was the only communications person in the office. We were going through a transition. I was like coming up to be the press secretary. I just interviewed to be the press secretary. They're going to probably hire another director. So it was like 28 at the time. And like, I got the call from the reporter that said, "Hey, I have these text messages." And then from there, things just kind of changed. And I'd been a spokesman for him before that, but it was just a different level of, involvement that I had. And even at that age, like, I wasn't even always in all the rooms. I was more so a facilitator.
Well, and that was his personal life, right? He wasn't bringing that into work every day with you. Yes. That's where you start to, go down that rabbit hole of like, that really wasn't what I was dealing with at the time, right? Like, I wasn't dealing with his personal life, but it became his professional life when they meshed.
Did. And I think that's, for good or bad, like on a, today versus 2008, we talk a lot about mental health and all those things. Like, that moment taught me kind of how to compartmentalize, like, okay, whatever I feel about what happened in his personal life doesn't really matter if I'm going to be a professional in the job that I do.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's and that separation.
Yeah, it is. And I was never asked to, compromise my integrity to do my job. And I think for any PR person, if you've not asked that, your job is to serve, especially when you're in these elected roles. And I'll never forget this. He came in and addressed us before those stories started to come out. And he said to us, he looked us all in the face and he said, "Look," he says, "some stuff going to come out. It's about my personal life. It's not great. We're both going to take some time with our families, but you are here to serve the people of Detroit.
Yep.
Do your job, serve the people of Detroit." And he said, "They're going to say a lot of things, but there's going to be a lot of people that still need us.
Yeah.
So go do that." And like, those are the kind of moments that, when you get to the end of something like that and all those things happen and people got a lot to say who weren't there and stuff like that, like, despite whether, people think he believed or did all the right things for the city, he had us all believing and knowing that our job was to really serve. Yeah. And so, like, I walked away from that moment, like, with a great confidence that I did my best. And, he instilled that in me. Mm-hmm. He gave me that because, he was saying, "You're here to do this." And I think that's, that I feel very fortunate about it, for that experience. And it's helped me in a lot of ways throughout my career.
Yeah.
I think that leads me to a question that could help some people listening too, is what would you tell a young professional who's interested in public affairs? That while that was a traumatic experience for him and the city and all of that, at the end of the day, it was a really good career opportunity for you and life lesson and what you can take other places. So, what advice would you give to them? How can they break into that type of career? What can they expect?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, a willingness to get involved in their community one way or the other. Mm-hmm. I think is where you start if you want to get into like a government communications role. I worked at a firm that fortunately had a relationship with that office that helped me, get in the door a little bit. But I think the other part of this was I was also very active in my community. I mean, that they saw that as a value in the mayor's office, that I did things outside of work that connected me to people. And so I could kind of carry the message in both ways. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think for any, young person who wants to do it, you see somebody that you believe in, volunteer. If you see somebody that you support, do something to amplify what they're doing. I think the key thing about electeds, and this has always been my a sense of pride. So I've only really worked for 3 electeds in my entire career. Mm-hmm. And there's some people, they choose, like, I just do this. I do elected campaign. I do an elected thing, da, 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 da. And I've always been kind of on in the government side. I've never really been the campaign person, but I always believed in all 3 of the people that I worked for, that they were people that I could get behind. And you can't do this job. You're essentially, you're a salesperson for a personality, for a person with ideas. And if you don't believe in what they're doing, don't do it.
And why should anyone believe you if that's the case?
Correct. Because I'm going to tell you something, like I probably with these jobs, I've had some impassioned conversations, not just when I worked for the mayor in Detroit, but like when I worked for Executive Warren Evans, when I work for Nathan Fletcher now. And like some people like knock on my door and go, "Are you all right?" And I'm like, "Yeah." But like I get so worked up because I know that like at the end of the day, like I believe in this person and I'm going to go to the mat for this person because they're doing good stuff. And if you don't feel that way, don't get involved just to get involved because you think it's like a stepping stone for something else. Because otherwise you're not going to do your best work.
Yeah. And I feel like there's a lot of parallels with that and with communications for business or for brands or for anything. I mean, it's so much harder to pitch a story, pitch an announcement, pitch a technology if you don't really believe that it has the potential to change something or it has the potential to improve something. I feel like, the clients that we were always work best with are the ones that you can see the impact, you can see why it's innovative or why it's helpful to the community or whatever it might be. It just gives you such a better selling point. And I feel like people can see through that if you don't believe it.
It does. And I think that that's where, firms like Franco and others in town, like there's a real commitment to where you do business and where your team works, right? Or lives and works. And I think that, for me, when I was there, even after I left the mayor's office, like I didn't look early on, I might've taken 1 or 2 clients that I didn't really like. Frankly, I needed to live.
Yeah. Then you got bills to pay.
Over the course of that 5 years or 5.5 years that I did it, like I got to a place where I could be a little bit more choosy on like what I really wanted to do. And I always, in my vision, knew like, I want to work with people who care about the city, people who are amplifying the city. Like, I love the Paxahau guys, right? Because like they came to me, they knew me from working in the mayor's office, and they came and said, "Hey, do you want to help us?" And they had, I'd been to the festival and things like that. Mm-hmm. And I said, "Look, guys," I said, like, I don't really know techno music.
Right.
Like, is that okay? And they're like, "Well, yeah, but you know this city. Yeah. And what you do is you understand that I want you to understand we're trying to be this great asset for this city. Yeah. And because of that experience that you have, like you can help us do that." And that was a part of our trajectory at that point. Like they were new, they had just taken over a couple of years. And it was all about like, how do we mainstream the idea of this techno festival that sometimes would get, maligned for, it's drug culture, or there's, but the economic impact from that event is tremendous.
Yeah.
And so for the 4 years or so that I worked with those guys, that's what we did. And then, frankly, they moved on to a great team member who was great at like the national stuff when it came to like the techno scene. They'd already we established them as like, just as important as an auto show or something like that kind of. So.
Yeah, that has to have been a cool experience to work with that festival. I mean, it just brings that park alive so much over the summer. It's just, and it's not even just for people that are, all about techno, obviously. I mean, people come down just because it's a cool event. Yeah. It's fun. It's, it's something.
But this is another example of like, as a public relations person, communications person, like you got to just do what you know, right? So like when I went to work with them the first year, I'll never forget, like the way the process was for media was, like I credentialed them, we checked them in, we did background checks, all that kind of stuff. And then we checked them in and then they just went into the festival. And then you kind of never really saw them again unless they asked for an interview. Yeah. And so the second year I worked with them, I was like, hey guys, like, don't we want to capture these people? Like, don't we want them to like be kind of like in our midst all the time? Like, because otherwise you just go out and some of these people, they have blogs and they maybe have more fun and they write one story on the weekend. Right. And so the second year we did a media area, right? We offered Wi-Fi, places to plug in your phones, snacks, all this kind of stuff. And then you walked in and they were kind of on top of the VIP area. So they got to see a lot of the artists coming through and stuff like that. Cool. And like, that was me going, all right, I don't know techno, but I know comms.
Right. You gave them an experience.
Correct. And it was just a different way. And the reality was that the journalists were appreciative of like kind of the ability to kind of have a place to rest and do all their work. But then it gave them access that they hadn't really had before. Yeah. And so like, again, that's use what you know, to any young PR person, like use what you know and it'll work in the end. And now they still do that to at least the last time we talked about it. So.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot when we're in like the recruiting phases or things like that at Franco. It's like you can teach people to write, you can teach people to do X, Y, and Z skills, but what you can't teach is that like inherent knowledge of like knowing how to just interact with people and knowing what the media wants and knowing like that kind of thing. It's such an important skill for communicators just overall to just
and some of it comes with time, right?
Yeah, of course.
It comes with time and it comes with experience, and I'm sure that you all throw the younger generation of your team members into the mix, and sometimes they got to swim a little bit. But once they swim, like they're like Michael Phelps. If they want to be.
I think that's a great point that leads me into, for those people who might not know, James has a podcast of his own specifically with the media. So it's called Flack Talk. And you really try to amplify the voices of journalists, right? Because they're always telling stories, and it's not usually their own, right? They're telling other people's stories. Can you talk a little bit about how you got into podcasting and how you came up with that idea? Like, what sparked that?
Yeah. So a few things. So I've like I mentioned that journalism class at Wayne State, like, I took about 5 journalism classes as part of my PR degree. And what I realized is like, I learned a lot of theory. I learned a lot of things in all my PR classes, but those journalism stuff like really taught me that interaction that you're going to have and to be that media person. And so I've always worked really hard to have strong relationships, even if I was in a situation where maybe my bosses weren't always, loving the media at the moment, or weren't always getting the kind of coverage they wanted. My job was always to be above that. That's what I was taught early on. And so for me, I've just always made it a point to try to make real relationships with journalists. And so when I moved to Seattle, like I had a lot of conversations with journalists. I didn't know anybody. And so I was like trying to like meet journalists, had conversations with them. But then when I got here in San Diego, I did the same thing. Hey, what's going on in town? Like, I'm new. Let's sit down. We had coffee. Some people wanted to have beers. There might have been a couple of journalists that drank a little too much. That was fine. But that inspired me to like be like, and some of these people would tell me really fascinating things about their background. Or they talk about their families in ways that you just wouldn't. You see this very attractive face on television, and they're very prim and proper and they're kind of doing their job, but then they're like sharing with you about like, their kid, like having a blowout diaper and like what that feels like and stuff like that. And so like, it just, I just found it fascinating. And so I said, okay, James, like I was looking for a reason to kind of stretch some of my skills. And I said, because I never did like editing or, I'm not sure if you guys have to edit this podcast or you got somebody else who does that. Right. But like, for me, that was like a whole, like, I got a great guy on my team right now that does all that video, audio stuff.
Right.
And so it was a reason to stretch myself, but it was more about like, can I talk with folks, like I was having those conversations over coffee and some beers, really help other people see them, because they're humans like you and I. They deal with stuff every day. Like, and my hope in doing it is to really help the journalists tell their stories a little bit more, humanize them a bit, but then also help hopefully other communications folks, especially young PR people, to realize that like you can't just get your news. Look, the news industry is going through a big transition right now with the way in which we can put out our own content and all those kind of things. But the reality is that news, you could look at polls. I've dealt with polls in my current job that the name recognition comes a lot still from media. The brand recognition comes from media, whether they're sharing it, you're watching it on their television station, or you're seeing it on their Twitter accounts or their Instagram accounts. So like, and it's journalists doing these things. And so I just thought it would be interesting to do. And I've gotten a great response so far. I'm talking to journalists here in San Diego. I've talked to journalists in Pittsburgh. We're going to drop some pieces from them. Folks in Detroit as well. I just dropped one with
we just saw Jerome Fun.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a fun little thing, 30 minutes, it's just like,
I think it makes a good point that journalists and people in the media can be people you interact with daily, weekly, but you still don't know them personally, right? No, and vice versa. But you can have these wildly long interactions with them that feel more like an exchange, right? They need something from you. You need something from them.
Very transactional, right?
Yeah. Very much so. And so what you're doing is putting a person behind it. And that probably even helps PR people when they're reaching out to say, hey, oh my God, I heard your story about X, Y, or Z. Yeah. And, I can relate to that and whatever. And that at the end of the day builds relationships, which is how you get media coverage half the time anyway.
Yeah. I think that that's the nugget that people don't pay enough attention to, right? It's like, you talk to journalists who like, I got a press release that has nothing to do with what my beat is, right? Or I have and so like when you really start breaking it down, it's like, you look at the news organization and the times in which they got opportunities for content. Then you look at the reporters and what they cover, right? But then if you get another layer down and like, like the health reporter at this station or this newspaper, they've personally had, I don't know, something in their family, I'm making it up, that is dealing with a cancer issue. And then all of a sudden you're working for, a cancer institute, it just gives you another level of like depth that you could have a conversation with them and frankly, maybe get them to buy in on something that wouldn't really be helpful to them, or maybe wouldn't be a normal story, but you now know something a little bit more. Journalists, I've had a lot of conversations with people. They're like, I just don't like, we are more than just this transactional thing. And I think that that's unfortunately how too many communications folks look at them. They got to fill a deadline and they got to fill a hole in the news. But like, if you build a real lasting relationship, you can always call back on that. I've had some journalists say, well, I don't know, there's a line, I can't do this, or I can't, have that kind of conversation with you. And because they're skeptical people. How are you going to use that information, James? What are you going to do? Well, I'm not going to use it for anything other than like maybe knowing what I know about you. And I'm going to share things with you. It's reciprocal.
Yeah. I think that's important. We've talked about it, that the best journalists to work with are the ones that truly care about what they're writing about. It shows. There's a big difference. So, okay. And so is Flack Talk on all platforms. Where can people find you? What's your social handles, your LinkedIn? Yeah. Give us all the details.
Oh, I appreciate that. So I haven't created separate handles for the podcast. Yeah. As a comms person, I noticed like sometimes like people just create a new Twitter handle and they have the damnedest time getting anybody to pay attention. So like my thing is like, so it's like all my handles are at James E. Canning, right? So it's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Okay. And then so flacktalk.com is the website where you can download the episodes, but then we're on everything: Spotify, Apple, Odyssey,
Perfect.
Deezer. I even started putting it in my YouTube channel. So I think it's
love that.
So everywhere you get the podcast, those great services that distribute it,
and we'll link it. We'll make sure that in
sure.
our description we've got links to all of it so people can find
Appreciate
it.
that.
Because I think what you're doing and the conversations that you're having are important.
Yeah.
So absolutely.
Thank you.
James, this has been a fun conversation. I feel like these are things, it's definitely stuff we haven't talked about before.
Yeah, for sure.
I think it'll give people a whole new perspective on public affairs and the work that goes on. Feels like the further in society we get, the more criticisms and crises that happen. So, there's a lot to be learned about how to navigate that. And I feel like you've done a really good job. So thanks for joining us. This has been fun.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, James.
Tales from the Beat. Welcome, Ed.
Thanks, Rachel. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Ed.
Hi, let's talk about headlines.
Okay.
That's the hardest part.
It is.
What's fun about headlines, right? Remember the wordplay, like when you'd open the paper and there'd be some cool wordplay in the headline.
I always think about Time magazine.
Yeah.
They do the really cool, picture along with some sort of really short, sweet, punchy headline.
Oh, yeah, because it's wordplay and people love it and it hits home. I know when I worked at the Detroit News, the reporters don't write the headlines. Right. And then I'd love to open the paper the next day and see what the headline writer did with my story.
Yeah.
Sometimes I was appalled because they totally mischaracterized the story. But when they had a great one, you just went, wow, that's going to sell my story. You know?
Well, and clickbait has become such a, hot term. And some of these headlines now have become clickbait, right? The story might be true.
Right.
But you have to twist it to grab attention.
Right. Exactly. But here's a sad reality, is that in this day and age of SEO, search engine optimization, wordplay is going by the wayside, and everything's become formularized where you have to, instead of writing headlines with word, because Google doesn't understand, right? Artificial intelligence, algorithms, they don't know from wordplay.
Yeah, not quite that smart yet.
Right. I mean, maybe this chatbot understands it, but generally it doesn't. And so the whole way of thinking about headlines for stories has changed. And I'm bringing this up because it has to do with not just a reporter, but the way PR people might write a headline for a release, the way you might write a headline for a blog post that you're writing either for the agency or a client. So I wanted to bring a couple of real life examples to your attention, which is going to be very eye-opening. So I'm going to give you 3 different takes on the same story. Okay? So last week, recently, J.D. Power put out their annual vehicle dependability study.
Yep.
All right. This is the headline of the release. Okay? It says, vehicle dependability improves despite continued problems with technology. Okay. Does that smack of wordplay? This is what they're sending reporters and putting on the PR newswire.
Yeah.
No.
Pretty straight
No
to the
wordplay.
point. Yeah.
Okay. Now, the Detroit Free Press, who's their audience?
Local Detroit.
Yeah.
Local Detroit. What do they say? The study. GM shines, Ford fails to impress in new J.D. Power dependability study ranking. All right. So now you're writing your headline for your audience. Yeah. The first one was kind of vanilla because it's to reporters. J.D. Power couldn't take...
Well, and it's put out by J.D. Power, so they can't talk smack or make anybody shine.
Right. They can just tell you who did the best in their study, and then it's up to you as a journalist to pull that out.
The numbers.
All right, Free Press has a targeted audience, local people in the domestic auto industry.
Yep.
They want to talk about, okay, now it's my turn. I had to write the story for Forbes. Forbes does not have, this isn't for the magazine, this is for the website.
Online, yeah.
Right.
The stories are only found, for the most part, by Google search. What does my headline say? Tesla tanks while industry improves in long-term dependability study. Why did I write it that way? Why didn't I?
Is a
Everybody's
hot
searching
word.
Tesla.
Yeah.
So
It's not local. It's nationwide.
Tesla. More than that. When we write a headline that's SEO based, I go to Google Trends, and you think of, okay, what if I said GM? What if I said Ford? What if I said this? What if I said that? Which one's going to trend? Mm-hmm. You put Tesla in, it's 100. From 0 to 100, it's 100.
Yeah.
Not up and down.
I believe that all the time.
It's straight.
Always.
You
Yeah.
could put an egg on it and it wouldn't roll. Mm-hmm. Okay? Now, what's at the bottom? What's at the bottom is Hyundai. Hyundai did really well. They're at the bottom. They were like in second place. The Genesis luxury brand. They were in second place.
But their SEO was what?
Was down at the bottom, almost flatlined. Almost flatlined.
But did they
So we're
do
not
well
leading
in the
with that.
survey?
They did well in the survey.
That's
but,
okay.
But the SEO was almost flatlined.
Right.
Who did the best? Lexus. Lexus was less than half of Tesla's engagement.
So you can't lead with any of these.
Can't lead with any of these. So you have to think of what's going to grab them. Mm-hmm. Okay, Tesla. Now it's funny, in the J.D. Power release, Tesla was almost a footnote.
Really?
Just-
Because they did so
Oh.
poorly,
At the bottom.
or because
No, because it's a technicality, I don't want to get it, but because Tesla doesn't allow them to survey people in every state, they didn't get like an official ranking.
None
okay.
of this surprises me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. So, in the interest of time, I'll give you one more that we could play with. This is a real one. This is one, and I'm going to read two headlines to you. You tell me which one you think is the good SEO and which is the bad SEO.
Okay.
First one: Alaska Airlines eliminates plastic cups.
Okay.
Second one: plastic cups out at Alaska Airlines. Which one's a good SEO? Which is a bad SEO? What do you think?
I would say the bottom one, the second one is it's like it's written for a human. It's
Right.
got the little bit of play on words, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that one's probably worse.
Saying it's out, right?
Yeah.
Instead of eliminating it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good,
with that.
because the term Alaska Airlines is way up here, almost 100. From 0 to 100, almost 100.
Would not have expected that.
Plastic cups, flatline.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why
I would expect that.
Yeah, that's why you have to do the comparison. So anyways, so that's the lesson here. When you're writing your headline, think of your audience. What terms are going to connect with your audience? If it's physical media, a newspaper where people are going to see it, and I mean, people still do read newspapers somewhat, even online.
Yeah.
They read,
for sure.
They are using traditional type of headlines with wordplay that appeal to their target audience.
Okay.
But if you're just on the web, if you're only publishing on the web, it has to be found. And the only way it's going to be found is through search. And if you want it to be found, you've got to find the terms that people are searching.
You gotta play the game.
And we'll even see, like, in some of these, like Free Press or News or whoever it might be, you'll see one headline in the paper, a completely different headline on the digital version of it, just to mix things up and make it fit. So.
And by the way, the Alaska Airlines headline that you chose correctly, that was the one that they used on the PR Newswire.
Smart.
Okay.
Yeah,
Smart.
that's our tale.
Yeah, we do this a lot in writing website copy too.
Yeah.
You know, if you want to show up in a search, relate, right? Like if your client is automotive, there are certain words that people are searching more often that you want to make sure you're repeatedly getting into your content on your website, in your blog, on your About Us page, right? I mean, this can be taken across so many different places.
It gets really granular. The difference between GM and General Motors is amazing.
I believe it.
They're not even close.
I believe it.
So,
Very good. Thanks, Ed.
you bet.
Thanks.
Thanks again to James for joining us all the way from San Diego. I really enjoyed that conversation. I feel like we say that every week, and I know we probably sound like broken records, but
They're all just good.
they're so
Yeah,
good. Yeah. Everything that we talked about is linked below in the description box. So be sure to check those out. Give his podcast a listen. If you do anything in the media relations space, I know we talked a lot about it in the interview, but humanizing journalists and understanding their story.
Yeah, taking time to make a relationship with them.
Right.
It's so important. That's
right.
what we do.
Absolutely. And thanks again to Ed for giving us another Tales. And we'll talk to you in 2 weeks.
Thanks.
If you liked Flack Talk and want to learn more about your favorite muckrakers and newsbreakers, please hit the subscribe button or visit flacktalk.com. New Flack Talk episodes with James Canning air every other Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts.